It's interesting that you use the word by the Taliban that they say that they're hunting ISIS-KP, ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan down. It's I think it's interesting to note we don't know who's hunting who down, and that kind of alludes to the transactional and almost revolving door nature of the people that join either the Taliban, Al Qaeda in Iraq, then Syria, or ISIS, or what turned into the Islamic State. And the Islamic State, at its peak, occupied parts of both Iraq and Syria. It grew out of Al Qaeda in Iraq, or members that had basically spent time in US detention facilities like Camp Buka, who were at one point in time under the tutelage or instructions of Zarqawi, who was, considered one of the masterminds or the founder of Al Qaeda in Iraq. And then it kind of spreads. And once this group fragments, once Zarqawi is killed allegedly by Jordanian intelligence, then the disciples, so to speak, spread out. And then you have the emergence of people like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and so on and so forth. And I think it's important to note that ideologically, these groups have a lot of convergence in what they profess. But there are also nuances which then went on to create structures in Iraq and Syria that basically lent to this. It's interesting because I spent, I think in 2017, between the spring and summer of 2017, a group of journalists, about 3 or 4 journalists that were able to enter into Idlib. And we were probably the first journalists to go into Idlib officially and cover what was Jabhat al-Nusra then, which turned into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is now essentially the ruling governance setup led by now Ahmad al-Shara. And why is Ahmad al-Shara, then known as al-Jolani, so important? Because I think in his story lies the story of ISIS-K, of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria, and how this group or these individuals were able to turn and be pragmatic and then create parallel structures, and then those structures were destroyed, and then they were able to survive and create even more structures. And this is what we see in ISIS-K. It became a brand, it became a magnet to attract individuals from as far as the United Kingdom, from as far as Australia, from France. And during that trip in 2017, when ISIS-K had Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS had largely been eliminated by a coalition that involved the PKK or the Syrian arm of the PKK, the YPG, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which were patronized by the Americans and given this name of the SDF or Syrian Democratic Forces to take them away from the terrorist label of the PKK or the YPG or the Syrian branch of it. It went to show, and I'll mention a few instances here. So we went into Idlib, we met Syrians, but we also met Tunisians who had come from France and who were living in Idlib at the time under the tutelage, the cover provided by Jabhat al-Nusra, which turned into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So these people were ideologically driven. Some were doctors, others were engineers, and they had come to Syria at a time in the hopes that a new Islamic State was being created. But it wasn't just one Islamic State, because people were bringing in their own ideas, their own interpretations of what it meant, of the ideology, of what their interpretations were of the holy texts, of the nuances there, what was allowed, what was not allowed. Some part of it. Others would come in as opportunists. There were also arguably people that were linked to intelligence agencies, as it turned out, various intelligence agencies. And I think that kind of alluded to the flux, to to the transient nature of what the Islamic State was. And because it was so transient, and because it was there wasn't a set idea or a set basis to create this so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, it evaporated and disappeared as quickly as it emerged. And when it disappeared, a lot of the people that were aligned with it or that were ideologically driven or part of it then also kind of fragmented and dissipated and were absorbed by groups such as Hayat Tahrir Sham, previously Jabhat al-Nusra. Some went into other factions, some went into Turkish-aligned Murad Brigade, and so on and so forth. So there were various shades of gray or various shades of black or blue or whatever you want to call it. And I think that kind of summed up the experience of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, which basically then turned into various other factions. And then one of those factions is now in of Syria as a whole, has created a quote unquote legitimate or at least a government which is accepted by the United States, by Turkey, by Saudi Arabia, by Qatar, even to an extent by the United Arab Emirates. And that goes to show that ideas can change, ideologies can change. The people that pass through these structures can also change. And I think this also replicates to an extent with what happens to these groups and these individuals in the context of ISIS Khorasan.
Okay, let me now bring in this element of intelligence agencies, of proxies, because often, what has happened in Syria, it is said that probably he was one of the proxies for the American intelligence agency. Now, to what extent can we, if at all, relate this entire thing to Afghanistan? Have there been any linkages with between the fighters in Syria and those who were training them in Afghanistan or elsewhere?
I think an interesting character to focus on in order to tell this story is a guy called Mohammad Goran, who was recently, for example, detained on the Pakistan side of the Pak-Afghan border in a joint Turkish and Pakistani intelligence operation. Goran allegedly speaks fluent Turkish. He speaks Arabic. He might even speak, a little bit of Pashto or whatever. But going back to 2017 and basically the tail end of ISIS in Syria, when we entered Idlib, there were certain individuals that were only speaking in Turkish, right? And some of them, I'm not saying they were definitively, but some of them were definitely involved in one way or the other with Turkish intelligence. Meet was known at that time to have its assets on the ground just to keep an eye and to liaise, to communicate back and forth. And the assessment in Afghanistan, if you ask the Afghan Taliban, for example, they will tell you that the ISIS-K members that they have captured alive, and some of them who have been killed, were in fact Turkish, not necessarily from Meath. They would also claim that some of these people were involved with intelligence agencies in Pakistan. The Pakistanis, on the other hand, would say that some of these individuals have intelligence links to India. You have to understand it in the fluidity of the situation and how fluid these groups are. And because of the revolving door nature of these groups and the individuals that become part of it, it doesn't know, or people that, one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. And this basically lays or gives credence to this idea of who is actually operating what. Are these toy soldiers? Are these buttons that are being pushed, being placed in certain positions at certain times? Another instance, I think, which the Afghan Taliban at least use as an example is the killing of Khalil Haqqani in December of 2024, exactly 1 year ago. 24th December, he was praying, and this individual comes in and he is basically patted down. There's a CCTV footage of this individual coming in, the alleged attacker, and he goes into the mosque in one of the most highly secure areas in Afghanistan, and he goes in and he basically blows himself up. And Khalil Haqqani, who was considered one of the iconic, Soviet era mujahideen, the uncle of Sirajuddin Haqqani, the current interim interior minister of the Afghan Taliban, he is killed in these attacks. So the fluid nature and the fact that these people can reach even at that level, even despite all of that security, the highest levels of, or infiltrate the highest levels of command structures in Afghanistan or elsewhere, in Syria, maybe, for example, at least makes the Afghan Taliban believe that there is something more to it, that these people are being directed in a coordinated manner by intelligence apparatuses, structures elsewhere. And for example, what happened in Bondi, in Sydney, for example, right? These two individuals who it turned out were a father and a son. Basically, they were father and son. The father came from India, was traveling on an Indian passport. They traveled to the Philippines. They go and allegedly train with a group affiliated, formerly maybe Abu Sayyaf, or affiliated currently with ISIS-K. And they pledge allegiance or whatever, the backstory. Australia is one of the most difficult places to purchase a gun, even today, right? Even at that time. But they had access to guns. The father apparently had access to guns for many years. To say that intelligence agencies aren't monitoring individuals or they're turning a blind eye, I think would be naive. Because we know for a fact in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, various intelligence agencies, even here in Canada, CSIS, have detailed records. And I know for a fact, I covered one of the first stories I covered in Canada in 2010, CBC, was the case of the Ottawa 3. It was a setup by the RCMP in which they basically set up a McGill trained pathologist, a guy called Khurram Sher, whose parents had come from Pakistan. Very studious guy, student. He had even appeared on Canadian Idol. And he was set up by a guy called Hiba Khalizadeh. Hiba Alizadeh was a Sunni Kurd who had come from Iran and migrated to Canada. And at one time, this guy was even an informant or a source for the CBC. As it turned out, this was the guy that basically entrapped Khurram Sher. And we're talking about 2010, the fall of 2010. Islamophobia is at its height, right? A lot of different things are happening. Osama bin Laden is hiding somewhere in Abbottabad or being hit somewhere in Abbottabad. So, as it turned out, it was a complete entrapment. Khurram Sher's life was destroyed. It was proven in court 5 or 6 years later that it was an entrapment. Hiba Khalizadeh still remains in prison. Nobody knows who directed him, on whose instruction he was doing this. There were some reports, and I remember Salim Shahzad, may Allah rest, may he rest in peace. There was links that Hiba Khalizadeh had traveled to Afghanistan via Pakistan. But in all honesty, for us to think that these things are happening organically or just organically, that there isn't any plan, that there isn't any direction, be it with ISIS Khorasan, be it with Hayat Tahrir Sham or Jabhat al-Nusra before that, or even with the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. And we saw how brutal these murders were, the beheadings, completely televised in the orange jumpsuits, James Foley, for example, being beheaded by these people. Who were these people? Where were they coming from? Some were traveling from the United Kingdom. Others were traveling from the US. Others were traveling from Australia. A lot of people were coming in from Europe. A lot of people were passing through Turkey, entering the border from Turkey. And now we know, and especially if you look at, for example, I think there's a Bengali origin British girl who is still in Syria, Shamim Begum or Shamima Begum. I can't remember her name specifically. It was proven, reported that one of her handlers was working in cahoots with Canadian intelligence or was known to Canadian intelligence. So again, The right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or either of them are doing. It's all operating in a gray zone, so to speak. Who is whose asset? What Gulf monarchy or what intelligence agency or what deep state element is pushing these buttons for what ends? You only find out after the fact, once it's happened, right? As happened with the Bondi Beach Sydney
Hmm.
attack, for
Yeah.
example. These guys go in, they're surveilling the area, the video's coming, they're shooting around with these guns, and it takes a bystander to go and stop them. So there are a lot of these questions, and
Okay. So
absolutely,
if you
it's
could
very
just, if you could just in 1 minute wrap up what you have just said, suggest that you don't know, who is handling them, who is directing them there. So are they being used, as instruments for interstate rivalries? You're talking about that possibility, I assume, that these are proxy terrorist proxy groups or instruments for settling interstate rivalries. And this is what we may also see now in Yemen, in Sudan, and in Libya. So just 1 minute, please.
I'll try to sum it up. We don't have to go as far away as Yemen, Sudan, or Libya. We know that there are transnational actors that are using proxies in all these instances. Be it in Yemen, we saw it with the Southern Transitional Council that was backed by the UAE under the same umbrella that was operating with the Saudis. We saw with Haftar. And we saw, in fact, that Haftar was being provided with fighters from Sudan paid for by the United Arab Emirates. And a lot of people disappeared and their families basically took out a protest. This is all on the record. There are UN reports that said that Haftar was using fighters from Sudan provided and paid for by the United Arab Emirates. In turn, there are also UN reports that said that Haftar's militia, members of Haftar's militia, were fighting alongside the RSF. Now, these are militias and these are groups. Coming back to terrorist organizations, if you go into, for example, Balochistan, and if you move back about a few months ago, maybe in March of this ending year, in 2025, we saw that the BLA attacked an alleged camp in Mastung, where ISIS 36 people were training or were being trained, allegedly belonging to ISIS Khorasan, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, Lashkar-e-Toiba, and different other organizations or groups. And I know for a fact, Taliban have told this to me, that ETIM and East Turkestan, the East Turkestan movement that was basically out of Xinjiang, some of their members were being kept in Bagram up until the Donald Trump made that demand of handing Bagram over, and the Pakistanis started to basically attack the border areas, and they were threatened. So they moved these people from Bagram allegedly towards the north of Afghanistan in Kunar, for example. So again, going back to it, these are instruments, these are toy soldiers, quote unquote, or buttons that are pushed at the right time, but sometimes at the wrong time. And because these are individuals who are passing through this transient nature of these groups that have no legs, no head, no arms. They're like octopuses but invisible. So it's very difficult to pin it down, and pin it down on who we don't know.